Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Dishing with Stephanie's Dish podcast, where we talk to people in the food space. A lot of times we're talking to cookbook writers, but today we are talking to someone who's a self-described forager who does forest landscaping and creates food forests in people's yards. He has his own food forest in the Longfellow neighborhood in Minneapolis and is also the founder of Minnehaha Falls Landscaping. Russ Henry, I'm so glad to have you here today. I first read about you in the Star Tribune and I was like, how do I not know this man?
Well, hi, Stephanie. Thank you very much for having me here today. And it's a pleasure to meet you and get to know about your podcast too. I'm surprised that this is the first I'm hearing about your podcast too. So it's a meeting of the minds here.
Absolutely. So I read the article and it basically talked about how you started in foraging. And why don't you give me in your own words sort of your trajectory, because it's obviously part of your business, but you must have obviously personal hobby and passion about it.
Yeah, I am absolutely enamored about plants. I just love plants. I love traveling to different places and getting to know the plants there. I absolutely love utilizing Minnesota native plants to grow food for the family, but also to make a very diverse wildlife environment in my yard. And so I started as a little kid growing food with my mom. We lived on a farm in Southern Illinois, and she taught me how to garden. And I just loved it so much that when I was a teenager, I started working in nurseries. And in the plant nursery environment, it really opened my eyes up to the world of plants, and I started just kind of seeing the world through plants. And so ever since, since then, I just continued my whole career working in landscape and plants, and have focused my career on soil health, pollinator health, water quality, carbon sequestration, and all of that can be found in a food forest.
Yeah. And you have a small yard in Longfellow, but you have, and you started out, you said gardening, and now you're completely going to the native food forest type of, and you can get, like, tell me how much food you can actually get from your yard, because it seemed like a lot.
Oh, well, yeah, we have a lot of different edible plants out here. We, of course, because I don't put up guards for the squirrels or rabbit fencing or any of that, we share a lot of the food that we grow with wildlife. But this summer, we counted 168 different species in the yard of plants. And our yard is just a small, it's just a regular sized Minneapolis urban lot. It's maybe 100 feet deep and about 50 feet wide, and with a house in the middle of it. So we really pack it in. When I moved in, it was all lawn, and it was mowed weekly, and we started creating veggie gardens throughout. We went organic right away, made a bee lawn to attract pollinators to the space. Then the veggie gardens came in, and then pollinator pocket gardens. And pretty soon I realized I was on a trajectory, and I started in my pathway towards growing in the yard here. And over the last 15 years, what's come to fruition here is that we have a food forest. It's an urban lot sized forest. So sometimes we think about forests as rolling hills and mountains, and here we're taking kind of the principles of the forest and bringing those to bear on the home landscape.
Yeah, and all Minnesota natives, right?
Not all Minnesota natives. Like, we have an apple tree, and we have a couple pear trees and cherry trees and plums that are not Minnesota native, but almost all Minnesota native. I don't know the percentage, but we're definitely over 80% with our natives. And some of the edibles that we have are native, like the hazelnut and the serviceberries. We have wintergreen, which is a fun ground cover that's a Minnesota native. Several of the edible species are native, and there's a lot of native plants that are edible that folks don't even know are edible.
Yeah.
So daylilies, for instance, every part of the daylily is edible.
Who knew that? I just found
Right.
that out like 2 years ago. And I was dying, and I love daylilies, and I have a lot of them. And like, would you eat it in a salad, or how would you eat it?
There's a lot of different ways. In the spring, the greens are fresh and yummy, and especially when they're young and when they're just little shoots, picking some of those, putting those in salads and eating them fresh is wonderful. Later in the season, you'll probably want to stir fry or add it in to a soup. It's a very mild onion flavor because it is part of the allium, a member of the allium family.
And also, I learned from my friend Alan Burgo, who's also a forager, that you can eat hostas. Who knew that?
Yep. Hostas, you can, of course, anything wrapped in bacon is delicious, but you can wrap them up in, wrap the spikes as they're growing out of the ground, cut some of those off and treat them like asparagus. You can wrap them in bacon, cook them in a little butter and bacon and some shallots, and it's delicious.
And do they then, is it ruined for the season, or do they send up new spikes, or how does that work?
Daylilies, especially if you got a nice stand of them, they will really continue sending up new foliage through the season.
So you don't have to worry about that. What about the hostas too? Because I've wondered about that. If I cut those little baby leaves, does that mean it's done for the season as a showy plant?
No, it'll send another spike up. You don't probably want to do this with the itty bitty plants that are just establishing. You don't want to over harvest, and even a well-established plant could be over harvested. So on a grown hosta, you might take no more than a third of the spikes as they're coming out of the ground.
Yep. Okay, cool. Because I think I'm actually going to do that this year because I've been thinking about it.
Yeah, there's some cool recipes out there for that.
When you are in your business and you're helping other people set up these types of landscapes, like for me, I just moved into my house 2 years ago, and I bought my house from a master gardener who's very interested in native plants. And of course, right away, I was like, well, I like flowers, so I'm going to add more flowers. And the deer came and have pretty much eaten them all. Like, there's a reason probably why she did this native planting, and it makes total sense to me now in hindsight. But when you're like helping someone transition their yard from a lawn to something more sustainable, where do you usually start? Like, what are the bedrocks that you have to think about?
Well, thank you. That's a great question. And of course, soil is the foundation. Healthy soil is the foundation of every healthy ecosystem. And so we help folks start we have a 7-step trajectory to get folks to reforest their yard. And within that 7 steps, the first step is quite simple. It's go organic. Stop introducing synthetics into the system. That's synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and pesticides includes herbicides and insecticides, fungicides, all the different isides. We don't invite them to the garden party anymore. So we start by going organic so that we can build the healthy soil system. And the reason that I say that is I practice soil microbiology. I was trained by Dr. Elaine Ingham in how to practice soil microbiology. So I will take soil samples before and after I see a lawn space being treated with herbicide. I've done that. I've tested samples in the ditch where there's perennial grasses growing, and then 5 feet away in the farm field where they've been treating with herbicide and insecticide. And what I can tell you is that the isides, the herbicides, the pesticides, they kill the soil microbiology. Soil fungi, bacteria, nematodes, arthropods, all of these creatures are very vulnerable to pesticides. So we eliminate them first so that we eliminate the pesticides first so we can build up the soil microbiology in order to have a healthy soil system underneath there to support the plants. Because after all, we got to remember that plants, they grow their food. Almost all their food that they need, they grow through photosynthesis. They create sugar all day long. But they're using about 60% of the sugars that they make to grow their bodies and 40% of the sugar that they make. That's a lot. They're emitting through their roots just to feed fungi and bacteria, which are the foundational creatures in a healthy soil ecosystem.
Right.
Fungi and bacteria actually work together to structure the soil. So that's the first step. Go organic, help the soil be healthy. That's the foundation. The second step then is a bee lawn. Have you heard of bee lawns?
Yes, I have.
So bee lawns are really fun. They're Minnesota is on the vanguard of a lot of healthy landscape types, and bee lawn is certainly one of them. Bee lawn is we have two seed mixes in Minnesota for bee lawn. It's a low walkable space that you don't have to mow, that has forageable plants so the bees can come in. People ask me, will I get stung in a bee lawn? No, I haven't had any of my clients. We do hundreds of these bee lawns. I haven't had any clients tell me that they're getting stung in their bee lawn. And I believe that's because the bees have plenty to eat. So it's a no mow lawn. It's excellent that way. You're saving on a lot of resources and time. And it's a great way to bring the pollinators in so that by the time you do get down to your veggie gardens and your food forest, where you're trying to really rely on the pollination services, you've been growing those pollinators all the way along.
So then, a question for you about that. Like, you, for bee pollinating lawns, you see things like clover, and I'm in this position where I really have creeping Charlie that I'm trying to keep out because it gets into my garden beds and it's just generally a pain. And yet I used to have clover, but then the clover didn't grow as much. So then the creeping Charlie came in, and then I couldn't distinguish between the two. So I was just pulling everything. And I kind of got into this weird space where now I'm like looking at this lawn that I don't really want the lawn per se, but I also don't want creeping Charlie to get into every garden bed I have. So what would you do for me?
Okay. So first of all, where you don't want Charlie, you need to pull it. So, and you pull it and then you overgrow. So it's remove and replace. You want to pull and then you replace it with something that's equally as strong. Now, I love creeping Charlie, actually. I think it's a wonderful plant, and I think it has a bad reputation out there. And, a lot of plants have bad reputations just because the chemical industries want us to hate them. Now, creeping Charlie, if we think about it, it's a member of the mint family. All bees love all mint plants when it blooms. Bees of all different stripe go for it. Minnesota native bees, bumblebees, honeybees, all love it. It's a super hardy ground cover that is drought resistant. And keep in mind that the landscape industry, the industry that I've been a part of my whole career, mostly wants us to rely on very weak plants. So they want us to rely on non-native cultivars. Those are weak just to start with. And then for the vast majority of the ground cover space, they want us to rely on Kentucky bluegrass, which is a very weak plant.
Right.
And we have to pamper it with all kinds of fertilizers. We have to give it, and it's weakened even further because we grow it as a monocrop. So I think when I look at a very strong plant that's capable of taking over a landscape, I go, that's a low maintenance landscape plant right there.
Okay. So then the question is, because I never thought about it like that. And I'm like, okay, that makes a lot of sense. However, I'm under the impression, and I'm sure it's wrong, that creeping Charlie is going to take over and crowd out other plants that I have in my yard. Is that the case? Because it climbs all over them and suffocates them.
Yeah. So it will climb over, hostas, and, it can take advantage of soil conditions that are better for a plant at creeping Charlie's phase of ecosystem succession than maybe what you have currently. Think of that as a soil problem. The soil is not supporting the deeper rooted perennials because it's probably more bacterially dominated, doesn't have enough fungal presence in it. The creeping Charlie over time will add more organic matter, but then that's going to over time allow other shrubs and trees to start growing up taller than the Charlie. So whenever I'm trying to beat a plant, be it creeping Charlie or buckthorn or garlic mustard, you name it.
Yep.
My strategy is remove and replace. And I'm always replacing with a stronger, taller native plant.
Okay.
So if I want to get rid of buckthorn, I'll remove it, and maybe I'll put in choke cherries or serviceberry. They come in a little bit taller, at least the same height, maybe a little taller, and very strong. Choke cherry is extremely strong, spreading native plant. So it's not the plant, it's not that I hate that buckthorn is spreading. I hate that it doesn't feed native wildlife.
Right.
It's not
No.
that I hate that Charlie spreads. It's that sometimes I don't want it to in my strawberry patch because it'll
Yep.
take out my strawberries. So I will control it. I will then really work on adding more fungi to the soil because we know that Charlie is an early ecosystem stage plant that loves a bacterially dominated soil. And the further down the road we go in ecosystem succession, the more fungi we get in the soil. So if we want to grow taller, more woody plants, stronger plants, we probably, especially if they're further along in ecosystem succession, we want to give them more fungi in the soil. And we add fungi to the soil by adding wood mulch and by making sure the ground is covered in green. Think about wood mulch as a temporary ground cover, and then you can utilize bee lawn or native ground covers or other ground covers as a long-term plan for covering the ground.
Right. For bee lawn, do you just start with seeds?
Yeah. There is one sod grower for bee lawn in Minnesota that I know of, and we're going to be testing out his new product next year. But otherwise, we do everything from seed. We have a rapid transition and a moderate transition. I have actually some excellent YouTube videos that I'll just plug right now. One
I'll
about
put them in
bee
the
lawns.
pods. Mm-hmm.
Oh, great. We've got a bee lawn video. We have a food forest video. These are all on the Minnesota State Horticultural Society's YouTube page.
Okay, I love that. So another challenge in my lawn here, just not to talk about me, but I do think this is something that more people are having to contend with is pests, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we've got the Asian beetles. I have the Asian jumping worms.
Oh, you do?
I do. And I have them. My neighbor has them. The neighbors above us have them. And the rain comes and it washes all the eggs down into our yard again. We have been treating them with I think it's a hull from the quinoa. It's an organic treatment, and what it does apparently is you sprinkle it on twice a year, and it kills the worm casings and the eggs if you do it at the right temperature. It's kind of involved, like what we're doing to just try to maintain this garden and the soil health because of these worms. And it's crazy. And I don't know if like I'm just unlucky, but I had them at my house in St. Paul too before I moved.
Very unlucky. Yeah, that's pretty rare.
Yeah, I feel like they're really way more than people know. So you talk about mulch, and we have to be super careful about mulch and make sure that it's heated at a high enough temperature so that supposedly it's killed off all these eggs of these things, but whether it has or hasn't, I don't know. It's kind of, I can dig in my soil, particularly in areas that are harder to treat because I have a really large yard. I have a really large, it's like a forest basically. I can like look down and I can see the worms like right underneath the top of the soil because they're eating all of the deciduous matter and making it all clumpy and like those coffee grounds, like exactly like you see in the pictures. Okay. So it's challenging me to stay motivated because you have to treat them, and it can be very frustrating and sort of gross when you're in your garden and you're just digging out these disgusting worms. Mm-hmm. But also like trying to think about different ways to utilize different ground covers and plants that have a root system that can sustain these worms.
Yeah. So thanks a lot for bringing up the jumping worms and other non-native insect species. So jumping worms, major problem, and could be something that actually in the long term forces serious and very big changes in the landscape industry. Here's what I've heard, and I've taken some classes on the jumping worms from scientists from the U of M. And so what I understand to be true is that they don't do well in native plant environments. The jumping worms in a meadow can't really thrive. They might be present, but they're not going to take over. In a lawn space or a hosta garden or a petunia garden, your kind of cultivar gardens, they go wild.
Yep.
So I want to do experiments. I've got a couple of experiments I'd like to do. One, I'd like to replace a cultivar garden with a native garden and just utilizing our normal methodologies and see what happens see if we can beat the jumping worms or if they beat us. I'd also would like to attempt an overwhelm strategy. So I'm always removing and replacing. And after maybe a quinoa treatment, as you're suggesting, for a removal, then maybe come in with a non-native. Now the fact is that there are no native worms in Minnesota.
Right.
So any worms we bring in are non-native, but if we bring in one that can't survive the winter, to overwhelm the numbers and try and eat up the organic matter, then maybe we can bring the overall worm population down, just simply by removing a segment of the Asian worm population, coming in then with red wiggler worms, compost worms that can't survive Minnesota winters, bring a whole bunch of those in, try and overwhelm the system so that in the summer where you're doing this treatment, during that summer the red wiggler worms go crazy and take over. Maybe that's enough to knock that, especially in combination maybe with the native plantings, would be enough to knock out. These are theoretical. I don't know, but it's a big issue.
And it's interesting because the worms are in the Chequamegon Forest. They're in the Superior National Forest. My garden up in Ely has them too. Yeah. And I probably brought them to my garden in Ely, not knowing on my shoes, or it's hard to say exactly how it happened, but and I didn't move any plants from St. Paul to the house that I'm in now. So I don't feel like I brought them into this house, but they were here. And anyway, it's a very interesting challenge. And I think people are I know it's being studied all over. And I do think it will change the landscaping industry, and certainly maybe the way that plants are shared and traded. But yeah, it's something that has been a little bit of a bummer in my gardening life, that I've had to just get my mind around it and see it as part of this ecosystem.
Yeah. I challenge everybody out there. I do 300 consultations a year, and at different, residential and commercial and home and even farm landscapes. And I get to see what's happening kind of when you piece it all together to the landscapes writ large in Minnesota. And so what I'd like to challenge everybody is to stop necessarily thinking about invasive species and start thinking about invadable landscapes. So we have taken all of these pristine landscapes that between the time of the glaciers and colonization were managed by native people and wildlife, using wildlife and fire, and they were managed to this degree of abundance that when you read historical accounts, I was just reading a historical account of Minnehaha Creek, which of course flows from Lake Minnetonka all the way to the Mississippi River and cuts east to west through the whole city of Minneapolis. That creek, before colonization or during the period of early colonization, the white settlers would go down to the creek and they'd be able to use pitchforks to get the fish out of the creek because they were so abundant, and they'd pitchfork them out into barrels. They take those barrels home and feed their hogs on these fish from the creek. So that's funny. The abundance we found, and that story of just kind of stealing that abundance from the land in order to put it into the fat of the pig. That story is, that's colonization, and that's where we're at. We've created these landscapes that we dismantled them, and then we attacked them, strapped them down with farmland and development. So I always talk about corn, soy, lawn, and pavement as being the four horsemen of the landscape apocalypse. And when we're seeing the ecosystems completely fall apart and all of the insect life, just disappearing around us, and the bird life too, well, this is colonization. This is a result of us creating invadable landscapes and trading wholesale, excellent, healthy landscapes for corn, soy, lawn, and pavement.
Yeah. When someone's thinking about turning their yard into a food forest or a sustainable ecosystem, is there like a price point? Like, is it like between X amount of dollars and X amount of dollars that people can budget? Because we spend so much money on lawn service and pesticides and all of these things. I don't think that when people think about going native that because it costs money to buy the plants, but
Yeah.
in the end, I imagine it's cheaper.
Yes. The basic starting price point on a fully native landscape, going from a complete Kentucky bluegrass lawn, is zero. A person can literally transition for $0. You don't have to go out and buy the plants. The birds will leave them on your property. They'll start growing. You can eliminate mowing, which will allow woody plants to start growing in the yard, and weeds too. And then you can selectively remove the non-native weeds, keeping the native weeds, allowing them to grow, allowing other natives to come in. And that's that was one of our main strategies for our first few years here, was just seeing what would come up when we stopped mowing.
Right.
We got mulberries that way. We got pagoda dogwoods that way, which, mulberries and pagoda dogwoods, they're both for sale at native plant nurseries. And you can spend, between $10 and, $500 on one of those trees. Now, anybody who's done a good amount of kind of landscaping ecosystem work will tell you that planting a small tree is much, much more effective for the long-term health and the trajectory of the growth of that tree than getting a big one. So a lot of folks say, well, I don't have time. I'm in my 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. I don't want to wait for, an oak tree to grow up. Well, just think of it this way. In 5 years, if you plant an acorn and you plant a 10-foot balled and burlap tree, in 5 years, that acorn is going to be half the size of your balled and burlap tree. And in 10 years, it's going to be the same size. And in 20 years, it's going to be bigger. So the smaller you start with, the bigger first the plant invests in its root system, in the soil system that you have. And so always start small. That's a way to bring the cost down. And then, just eliminate mowing. That's another way to bring the cost down. Other than that, think about creating pockets of your favorite plants in spaces throughout the yard. That's another inexpensive way to go. Now, how much can you spend? Well, how much do you have?
Yeah,
because,
sure.
Of course, with anything, you can get the Cadillac version or you can get the Ford version. So,
What's your favorite Minnesota plant right now that you're just can't get enough of, that you have at your business or in your yard, that you just think is a great performer?
Well, I'm nuts for oak trees.
I live in an oak forest.
Oh, there you go. So
I have 8 mature oak trees on my property.
Oh, wonderful. What kind of oaks?
I don't even know, actually. I think if I looked it up, I could find out, because the lady that I bought the house from gave me very detailed records. But, the oaks are super mature. It takes quite a bit to maintain them. We're giving them nutrients and trying to keep them from oak wilt, and trying to be good stewards of the oaks. But it's funny, my dog eats them too. And I've read that they can be poisonous in animals, but I can't stop him from eating them because I have so many. And
he eats acorns?
He does. And then he spits out I think he likes to chew them. I don't know how much he actually ingests. I think he likes the crunchiness of it and then spits out most of it.
Yeah. They have strong tannins in them that, acorns are edible for people, even if you boil out the tannins. But I'm sure a dog chewing on them and spitting them out. I mean, dogs get into all kinds of crazy things.
Yeah.
But oak trees, I'd love to consult with you about your oak trees sometimes, because I do encounter a lot of folks spiking them with fertilizer nutrients, and that's the wrong way to go with oak trees, because it will invite in bacterial diseases. So instead, we want to make sure that the entire under the canopy space is a native garden.
Yeah.
A multi-layered native garden. The reason I love oak trees so much is because they have the ability to host more caterpillars, more moths, and some butterflies than any other plant in Minnesota. Huh. So we have 7 native oaks in Minnesota, and Bur oak is my favorite because it's so gnarly looking and beautiful when they get big. It looks like it's out of a fairy tale kind of a
Yeah,
thing.
out of the Hobbits.
Right. Yeah. And so I love oak trees, and I always encourage folks, plant them in groups of 2 or 3 so that they have each other to rely on, only maybe 5 or 10 feet apart. That's how they'd grow in a forest. And that way, when the big winds come, they won't get knocked down as easy. And then underneath them, plant a native understory of ferns, sedges, grasses, and forbs that can expand with the canopy of the tree, so you don't have to mow up underneath it. And that way, when the caterpillars are in the tree, and keep in mind that caterpillars are extremely important because all of our songbirds have to have caterpillars in order to raise their young. So that's why I love the oaks, because they grow the caterpillars. But caterpillars, they spend a little bit of their time in the tree. And then 94% of all caterpillars drop out of the tree and have to have a soft landing under the oak tree in order to be able to grow into a moth. And for that life cycle to take place, we need that to happen tens, hundreds of thousands of times in our oak tree every season, so that the birds can come and get enough caterpillars in order to feed their young. Just one.
Birds?
What's that?
Do you feed birds seed,
yes,
or do you have enough in your yard from your plants?
In the winter, I do, because the birds that rely on seeds in the winter, there's not enough forage in my urban neighborhood for them.
Yep. I feed birds too.
So
and I are going to be fast friends. I just know.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was just reading, Doug Tallamy has some great books out there. I'm actually going to talk to him tomorrow. I'm doing an interview of him tomorrow. And he's written a lot about the keystone species, oaks being one of them. And he describes how a nest of baby chickadees will require, I think it's 2,000 that the mama bird bring back 2,000 baby or 2,000 caterpillars to feed those babies over just the course of like 14 days or something like that.
Yeah, that's
so it's
amazing.
Just thousands of these caterpillars are required to keep even just a few chickadees alive in the yard.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Well, we could go on forever, I have a feeling, but thank you for being my guest today. I've loved it. I have like 4 Serviceberry recipes in my cookbook.
Nice.
And I put them in there because I just love the idea of eating more of what we grow, and gardening happens in all kinds of ways. And I'm going to eat some daylilies this season. I swear I am.
Fun.
So thank you for joining us. I will link to some of your videos. I will also link to Minnehaha Falls Landscaping, and I'll include the article that was in the Star Tribune that details out some of the things you have in your yard. It's been a pleasure meeting you.
Oh, wonderful to meet you too. Thanks a lot, Stephanie.
Thanks for your time. I appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.